Alrighty. Well, it is 6:05, so hopefully everyone is settled in and ready to go. Welcome again to Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness, a conversation with Deshawn L. Harrison. And this event is being hosted by UIC's Radical Public Health. And you'll hear more about that organization in a moment. But first, we want to do our land acknowledgement.
We want to start off by acknowledging that the University of Illinois at Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire Peoples, purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lakes region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. The area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the US. And so by making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, and we're living here long before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. And as we work, live, and play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonization and state violence and support Indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. And we also want to have a quick content warning for this discussion. There will be some mentions of obesity, eating disorders, disordered eating, anti-Blackness, and trauma. So please take care of yourself. Feel free to turn off your video, mute, or log off as you need.
Hello, my name's Emma. I use she, her pronouns, and just wanted to briefly introduce UIC's Radical Public Health, and it is technically a student organization within the School of Public Health, but it is open to community members as well as alum, faculty, and school staff. And basically the purpose is to speak about what's considered more radical public health solutions and learn together. And by the way, we do have a live captioner with us today, so just know that that accommodation is available. Oh, sorry. And then you could stop sharing. So please welcome me in joining Deshawn L. Harrison. Deshawn is the author of Belly of the Beast, The Politics of Anti-Fatness as Anti-Blackness, editor at large at Scalawag Magazine, and often leads workshops on Blackness, queerness, gender, fatness, disabilities, and their intersections. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Deshawn. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. Hi, Brian. Thank you to everyone who has joined. I am so honored to be here and to share this space with you all. And so I will get into the program and not take up too much of y'all's time. And so we're going to start off by playing a word association game. If you don't know what word association is, it is a game, typically fun. In this case, it'll be more educational than that. But well, actually, before I start off, I want to start with saying that this moment at least, is going to be one that requires this space to be what I call a brave space, which is to say that there will be, and I thank you all for the content warning at the beginning, there will be conversations that may not feel safe or affirming in this part of the conversation, but I think that it's crucial to have this part of the conversation before we get into the actual talk, so that we are able to ground ourselves in a collective understanding. And so we will go into this next part, word association. Again, if you do not know what this game is, I'm going to give you all a word, and you're going to type into the Menti link that I think was just posted what comes to mind with you with this word. So I'll actually give you two words. The first word is fat. When you hear the word fat, what comes to mind for you? What feelings arise? What thoughts come up? what do you associate with this word, all of that. And the second word is obesity. What feelings, thoughts, understandings come up for you when you hear those two words? We're going to take a few minutes and then we'll come together again. I'm seeing some really good answers in here. Thank you all for being vulnerable enough to name varying feelings across the spectrum. Please continue to do so. Feel free to add some more thoughts. We have some more time, but I wanted to hop in and just comment on some of what I'm already reading. Okay, it slowed down a bit, so I'm gonna read some of these answers. So I see taboo, I see reclamation, I see shape, I see soft, I see me, undesirable, bad, shame, beautiful, powerful. I love that there's both unsexy and undesirable on here, as well as ugly, and then there's also beautiful. I see negative, I see my mom, I see stomach, misunderstood, judged, bulky, expensive clothing, tell me about it, internal shame, health problems. Okay. Big boned. Oh, I love that. And actually, I would love to talk about that in a moment. Food, overweight, too much space. Delicious, liberating, uncomfortable, family, epidemic. Ooh, I love that word. We're going to talk about that today. Okay. Disability, pleasure, self-esteem, policed, fetish, swollen. Okay, these are all great thoughts. I'm gonna ask, you don't have to, but if there's someone out here who made one of these comments and you want to talk a little bit more about why you wrote what you did, please feel free to do so. I would love to hear from y'all. Brian, because I know you're on here, I'm going to call you out if no one else talks.
You know you people want to talk.
Thank you, friend.
I'll go. Can y'all hear me okay? Good.
Yes.
So I wrote liberation, but that's a very personal choice. I am what I like to call an intermediate fat liberationist, in that I have been on this journey for longer than some, but not as long as many. And I see that it is a path of liberation that not only has to take place within ourselves to understand as fat people like myself, but also a journey that we have to drag so much of society along behind us for as well. So to me, it is a huge undertaking. And I'm just really grateful to be here, Deshawn. I've been a fan for a long time.
Thank you so much. And thank you for sharing that. Also, I see the person who wrote Big Bone in the chat, and if I'm looking correctly, I knew that this person was Black, because I only ever hear Black folks use Big Bone. So I thought that was very interesting and very, very cultural. Anti-Racist Family said that they want to talk about theirs.
Hi, can you guys hear me okay? Okay, cool. Hi, my name is Chloe, and I feel like there is so much pleasure in my softness, in my fatness. It is liberatory. It is my life. I've committed myself to being in a fat body and loving my fatness. Our whole family celebrates fatness. It has brought me so much pleasure in my life. I've never wanted to be a thin person. I am disgusted and uncomfortable at the idea of weight loss in any capacity for me and my body. I don't know, our family is fat, and it is straight joy. My partner loves fat. My sister loves fat. Yeah. My niece loves fat. She broke up with one of her best friends, and she's like 10. Well, she was 10 at the time, and she broke up with one of her best friends because they said, does this make my Barbie look fat? And she was able to recognize the fat phobia. And she like couldn't talk to her best friend for like 6 months. And she was just like, there's too much. And yeah, we commit ourselves to fatness and the liberation of fatness. Of course, the intersection of anti-racism. We are huge fans of yours, Deshawn. Thank you so much.
Yay, Bo.
Yeah, Bo. I think that we should check, as a family. I feel like we've taken up a lot of space, but it is straight pleasure and straight joy for us in all of our glorious fatness and cellulite.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for offering that. I love that. It is not often at all that you get to hear people talk about the joys and the excitement and the pleasure of existing in their fat body and loving their fat body. Is not in very mainstream body positive ways, but in a real understanding of, this is who I am, and this is who I want to be, and this is who I'm going to be. I think that's beautiful. So thank you so much.
Yes, exactly. Actually, in the last webinar that you did, I attended, and one of the questions was, what model do we see, being fat and positive? Mm-hmm. And there wasn't much discussion of who that is. And I personally think that's fat sex workers. That's exactly who I think that is. And I think that we are always like thrown away. And like, that's really frustrating, because I think that, aside from academia and like literature, I think that fat sex workers are at the forefront. Mm-hmm. For sure. And I'm not saying that every single fat sex worker like is in the lane of liberation, but just by what they're doing is liberation. And that representation of not like, for people who also love fat, not being able to see it. That's like the only representation of like fat pleasure. And that's really frustrating.
Yeah,
really frustrating. But
absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Just as a fat former sex worker, I see you. Thank you so much. I see some more folks in the replies. I put me because I'm okay with being me. It took a long time and many diets and exercise programs to accept myself. I hear you, Kimberly. I think that is very important. So many fat folks share that experience of going through diets and exercise programs before we were allowed to love and appreciate our bodies. And so I love that you put me and that you explained that. Thank you so much. Brian, I see that you're on camera, so can you say what you wrote really quickly while I read over this other comment?
Sure. I wrote several things, including powerful, nourishing, beautiful, but I want to add one, and one of those I think is conflict for me. And when I say conflict, I think about what I wish for and hope for and want to embody in myself as a fat person, and what the world continually tells me about my body and what experience about being fat should be, and the conflict that I feel. You know, we both lost somebody that was relatively important to us recently, and that experience of losing her, you know, made me suddenly be so much more worried about being fat than I had been in quite a long time. You know, and just the ways that it's so easy to come back to, you know, just the conflict of existing in a world that wants to constantly beat you down, that you being fat, your body, like that you are bad and undesirable and unlovable.
Yes, I love that so much. Thank you so much, friend.
Of course.
That word conflict is really, really good. That's really good. Okay. Okay. What time is it? Do I have time? Okay, I have a couple more minutes. I love this explanation of why you wrote stigma. Violetta, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Say that again. Violetta, thank you so much. I think that this is a beautiful, beautiful explanation for a stigma. And yes, there's so much that goes into this. I love that you mentioned the health industry. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. This is really important. And it's important to understand this and the ways that these things help to stigmatize fatness. So thank you so much for that offering. Summer says we put taboo because it's so liberating for some, but the word fat is still so painful for others. Absolutely. That's brilliant, I think, and is an ongoing conversation for a lot of fat folks in fat lib spaces around how we navigate that. And then the last one I'll read off. Undesirable because society's beauty standards say that we are all supposed to either be thinner. Yes, absolutely. Are we gonna talk about desirability today? Maybe. I think that's in the thing, but we're always talking about desirability with me. So I love that was named. Okay, perfect. Thank you all so much for engaging that exercise with me. It was important for me to bring that to this conversation because I think that oftentimes we approach these conversations with the assumption that we're all entering into the conversation with the same general consensus and understanding around fatness. And even though we didn't hear from everyone, right, I know that there are folks on this call who maybe do not see the power in fatness, right, who maybe do not see the beauty in fatness, who maybe are part of the folks who see fatness as unhealthy and, you know, and as a disease and disease as bad, right? I know there are folks on here who maybe, I see the word smelly here, who maybe do think of fat folks as smelly. That's a very common association with fatness for a lot of folks who are part of the crowd of folks who judge fat people, who harm fat people, who discriminate against fat people. And so I wanted to invite us into a collective exercise wherein we are able to really ground us in the varying ways that people understand fatness, think about fatness, move through fatness, navigate conversation around fatness before we get into the actual talk. So it is now 7:25 on my end, so I know that means I have to get into the things. And so I'm going to read to you all something that I put together. Some of this will sound familiar if you're someone who has read the book. Other parts of it will be new. If you haven't read the book, then the entire thing will be new for you. And hopefully it'll lead you to wanting to get the book. But I'm very excited to talk or to read this for you all over the next few minutes to really ground us in just a general understanding around the manufacturing of health as a concept and the ways that it as a term, as an ideology, has helped to wage war on fat folks, in particular, Black fat folks. And so we're going to talk about health, we're going to talk about BMI, we're going to talk about the obesity epidemic. All these things are going to be covered in the next 30 minutes while we go through this. And so I will talk with you all, read off a couple of points, and then we're going to have a Q&A session. And I'm really excited about that. Like, more than y'all know, because I think that's going to be space for us to really be able to dialogue, and that's my bread and butter. So let's get into it. According to the World Health Organization, health is the state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity. As I interpret it, this means that for one to be healthy, they must not only be non-disabled, but must also be in an environment that allows for them to feel mentally secure, physically safe, and socially well. As such, this means that Black people are always already unhealthy because we are always already unsafe. The creation of race through slavery was precisely intended to make Africans with their blackened or stained skin subjects. They became objects to be subjugated, poked and prodded, and turned, at least through language and especially through the ways in which they were engaged, into beasts. Built into the very fabric of modern society, created by Europeans and sustained by anti-Blackness, is the idea that Black folks are objects and subjects simultaneously, and therefore have no need for or right to safety or wellness. The slave was and has always been removed from wellness and safety, both through the total subjugation/domination and objectification of their being. In fact, for race to be constructed, the slave had to exist, and had to exist as the antithesis of health, so that European physicians, anthropologists, and other eugenicists could determine what set the slave apart from, as J.F. Blumenbach called them, the Caucasian. 18th and 19th century scientists based the idea of health on what Africans could and could not withstand, and created health issues based on what Africans would not withstand. Take, for example, Samuel A. Cartwright. In 1851, Cartwright named two illnesses that were exclusively found in Africans. The first of the two was what he called drapetomania, which was a mental illness that caused the slave to run away. The second one was called dysesthesia aethiopica, which was sort of a weakness or lack of work ethic that Africans would develop if they were not enslaved or otherwise in the possession of white enslavers. His suggested treatment, y'all, for both illnesses was to wash their open wounds, drape their bodies in oil, beat them with a leather strap, and force them to work in the field, specifically when the sun was beaming. Cartwright deemed them, the slave, psychologically abnormal and inept, and this would essentially birth what we now understand to be scientific racism. Medical apartheid, as named by Harriet Washington, is foundational to the creation of race, which is the creation of the Black, which is the creation of the slave. For as long as there is Black existence, there is a subject to be experimented on. For as long as there is a subject to be experimented on, health will always already be inaccessible to the slave. And as this is the case, health is a framework in which no Black person can ever fit. This is especially true for fat Black people. In Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia, Sabrina Strings details how fatness on the Black subject's body set the precedent for how fatness would be engaged in the US and the world as a whole. Fatness was once seen as something to aspire to, something that was attractive. The reason for this, however, was because at the time, fatness signified socio-political and economic power. What Strings makes clear in Fearing the Black Body is that it was fatness's alignment with whiteness that really made it attractive to Europeans. When Europeans saw Africans for the first time and saw that their bodies looked like them, but their skin did not, it was then that anti-fatness was established as a coherent ideology. Because fatness had become Blackened, it could only ever be impure and beastly. As the slave represented capital and forced labor, fatness could no longer be about status and power, so it became about greed and ungodliness. Strings argues that the fear of fatness and the preference for thinness are principally and historically not about health, but rather they are a way to legitimize race, sex, and class hierarchies. I lost my place. Okay, there we go. I agree that anti-fatness is not about health, insofar as the systemic bias against fat people is not predicated on a desire to see Black people mentally secure, physically safe, and socially well. However, because that is true, I would also argue that anti-fatness is about health to some extent. For anti-Blackness and anti-fatness to be legitimate, subjugating, and objectifying structures, their existence had to be predicated on a thing unobtainable by Black fat subjects. That thing is health. In other words, to legitimize race, sex, and class statuses, health had a job to do. This leads to the birth of the medical industrial complex, an institution built and sustained by race scientists and eugenicists dedicated to the continued death of Black fat subjects. To be Black and fat is to always live as socially dead, and health ensures that. In this way, race scientists and eugenicists used, and do still use, the Black fat as capital, products on which they build anti-Black and anti-fat structures like health and the medical industrial complex with the intent to maintain a hierarchy or social world order. Health, in name and in action, has always existed to abuse, to dominate, and to subjugate. The medical industry, the healthcare industry, and the diet industry all exist to maintain a culture intended to discipline those whose bodies refuse to, and for many, simply cannot, conform to the standards of health. Modern society enforces exercise as a punishment for this very reason. We are not taught to exercise for the sake of enjoyment, nor are we taught to enjoy our bodies in motion. We are taught that we exercise so that we can be healthy, and that health must always look opposite of fat. This means that health is punishment, so much so that there are entire camps dedicated to forcing children and some adults to exercise for the sake of weight loss. We call those fat or boot camps. The entertainment industry has created an entire market built on shaming adults into weight loss through reality television. Y'all know the shows. We call them My 600-Pound Life. We call them The Biggest Loser. We call them 1,000-Pound Sisters. These industries lead to real psychological harm, physical pain, and death, as do those shows. In 1999, a 14-year-old girl by the name of Gina Score died because of forced exercise and a lack of care around fat children's bodies. Gina, who had been part of a camp run and operated by military veterans, had been tasked with a 2.7-mile run. In the middle of that run, Gina fell on the ground and began gasping for air. Soon after, she began foaming at the mouth and hallucinating. After 4 hours of her instructors laughing at her while drinking soda, no less, and accusing Gina of faking, a doctor came outside and called for an ambulance immediately. Gina's organs had failed. She had died. In an extreme case like this, many would call what happened to Gina abuse. In fact, many did. Gina's case went on to introduce a national conversation around the mistreatment of youth in boot camps and erected new laws and policies in juvenile correctional facilities. But at the nucleus of her punishment was a push for weight loss as discipline and health and wellness as ways to correct or fix bad or broken behavior. It is also what led to her death. She was neglected, at least in part, because she was fat. The nearly 3-mile run she was forced to do, the idea that she was faking what would be her own death to avoid exercise, the fact that her instructors left her to lay in the sun while they drank sodas, a beverage people have long shamed fat people for drinking, were all targeted responses to her fatness, and it killed her. She was murdered by a culture designed to punish fat people at the behest of health itself. This is the perfect segue, I believe, into talking about BMI and how and why it's anti-Black. Black folks make up roughly 13% of the American population, but about 51% of America's fat population. Obesity is determined by body mass index, something people have been taught is a direct measure of one's health. Over 200 years ago, a Belgian mathematician, named Adolphe Quetelet created what we now know as the BMI. Quetelet was not a physician, nor did he study medicine in any capacity. Quetelet is known for his envisioning of l'homme moyen, an image of what he understood to be the average man, which he developed through the measurement of human features with the deviation plotted around the mean. He began the development with the use of physical features of the human, who, at least as his work suggests, he understood to be cisgender white men, particularly French and Scottish white men. After, he moved on to moral and intellectual qualities like suicide, crime, and madness. What he had created was the standard for male beauty and health, built only with white Europeans in mind, and determined by something that measured whole populations and not individuals. But by the 20th century, Quetelet's work was being used as the basis of and justification for eugenics. And though all of his work in that time period was based in anti-Black race science, to be clear, he was clear that the intent of the BMI was to measure populations to develop statistics. Aubrey Gordon, creator of Your Fat Friend and author of What We Don't Talk About When We Talk About Fat, wrote that by 1985, the National Institutes of Health had revised their definition of obesity to be tied to individual patients' BMIs. And with that, this imperfect measurement was enshrined in US public policy. In 1998, the National Institutes of Health once again changed their definitions of overweight and obese, substantially lowering the threshold to be medically considered fat. CNN wrote that millions of Americans became fat Wednesday, even if they didn't gain a pound, as the federal government adopted a controversial method for determining who is considered overweight. And to contextualize this, this is a year prior to Gina Score was murdered in the fat camp. By the turn of the millennium, the BMI's simple arithmetic had become a regular part of doctor visits. Charts depicting startling spikes in Americans' overall fatness took us by storm, all the while failing to acknowledge the changes in definition that, in large part, contributed to those spikes. At best, this failure in reporting is misleading. At worst, it stokes resentment against bodies that have already borne the blame for so much and fuels medical mistreatment of fat patients. As covered earlier, health was created as the antithesis of Blackness. From the moment white Europeans saw fat Africans, the science that followed was intended to always separate them from the rest. In this way, the BMI, created to maintain whiteness as superior, was always going to harm the Black fat. And it is for this reason that Black people make up over half of the fat population, and why Black people also have more health risks than their white counterparts. But speaking of misleading reports, in March 2004, during a news conference with widespread coverage, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the CDC, published a report that claimed that obesity was killing 400,000 Americans a year, and that it was becoming America's #1 preventable death, surpassing tobacco. The CDC defines obesity as weight that is higher than what is considered as a healthy weight for a given height. Body mass index, or BMI, is used as a screening tool to determine who is and who is not obese. The report was published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, which, at least at the time, was the most prestigious medical journal in the nation. Since Julie Gerberding, director of the CDC at the time, and other top CDC scientists co-authored this report, it had the credibility it needed for waves of reporters and news outlets to publish it. It would soon lead to egregious and violent headlines across the nation about fat people, fat bodies, and the alarming rate at which they were allegedly dying from obesity. It would also be cited repeatedly by officials, including then Secretary of Health and Human Services, Tommy Thompson, several members of Congress, and creators of weight loss drugs seeking to draw attention and funding to anti-obesity efforts. From that moment forward, throughout the rest of that year, 2004, public officials and other media platforms used that report as evidence that obesity was the greatest threat facing the American people. And y'all know they love talking about the threats to American people. And as justification for what would eventually become a forceful and strapping diet industrial complex. This was the start of what we know as the obesity epidemic. There were a few public indictments of the JAMA report, starting with Science Magazine in May 2004. In a report of their own, they wrote, "Some researchers, including a few at the CDC, dismissed this prediction, saying the underlying data are weak. They argued that the paper's compatibility with the new anti-obesity theme in government public health pronouncements, rather than sound analysis, propelled it into print." This became, at least on record, the first acknowledgement of an emerging anti-fat theme within government, health, and science institutions. Soon after Science Magazine's report, the Wall Street Journal published a story of their own that covered the errors in the study published in JAMA. On November 23rd, 2004, they opened their story with, "America's obesity epidemic may not be as deadly as the government has claimed." Continuing, they wrote that the study inflated the impact of obesity on the annual death toll by tens of thousands due to statistical errors. On April 30th, just a month after the later disputed report was published, Dr. Terry P., who was the Associate Director for Science in the CDC's Office on Smoking and Health, wrote in an email to his colleagues that he was worried that the scientific credibility of the CDC likely could be damaged by the manner in which this paper and valid, credible, and repeated scientific questions about its methodology have been handled. After stating that he had warned two of the report's authors, along with another senior scientist, Dr. Terry wrote, I would never clear this paper if I had been given the opportunity to provide a formal review. According to J. Eric Oliver in his book, Fat Politics, The Real Story Behind America's Obesity Epidemic, Dr. Terry was right to worry. A more intentional look at the method the CDC used to produce these calculations indicated that the numbers were far from accurate. In his book, Oliver says the CDC researchers did not calculate the 400,000 deaths by checking to see if the weight of each person was a factor in his, her, or their death. Rather, they estimated a figure by comparing the death rates of thin and heavy people using data that were nearly 30 years old. Although heavier people tend to die more frequently than people in mid-range weights, it is by no means clear that their weight is the cause of their higher death rates. It is far more likely, he wrote, that their weight is simply a proxy for other more important factors, such as their diet, exercise, or family medical history. The researchers, however, simply assumed that obesity was the primary cause of death, even though there was no clear scientific rationale for this supposition. In other words, the CDC contrived this number from an estimation after reviewing data that was 30 years old. One more time, I'm going to read that again. The CDC contrived this number, 400,000 deaths a year from obesity. They contrived this number from an estimation after reviewing data that was 30 years old. It was never a calculated number concluded from their own intense research. It was a scientific guess made with the hope to punish fat people for their bodies. And it worked. The damage had already been done. The people and institutions who would stand to benefit from that report had already won. And it was the start of the modern genocide of fatness and fat people. As Oliver states, fat people do tend to die at higher rates than their thin counterparts, but it isn't because of their weight. Fat people tend to die at higher rates than thin people because doctors misdiagnose them or refuse to treat them due to their fatness. In January 2005, the CDC admitted that their 400,000 deaths number was a result of a mathematical error. And in February of that same year, just after the CDC published a summation of the internal investigation that was launched following the initial report's release, the LA Times published a response to the investigation. Their report opened with this firm statement: a controversial government study that may have sharply overstated America's death toll from obesity was inappropriately released as a result of miscommunication, bureaucratic snafus, and acquiescence from dissenting scientists. This would become the second public acknowledgement of governmental disarray that was leading the nation in one of the most violent pseudo-epidemics in the nation's history. In April 2005, just a year after the initial report was published, the CDC released another report, also through JAMA, wherein they not only offered a much smaller number of deaths per year due to obesity, but also claimed that, quote, moderately overweight people live longer than people at a normal weight, end quote. The new report in JAMA cut the death toll to 112,000, which was well under half of what was initially reported, but the damage had already been done. Around the world, people were using the CDC's original numbers as fuel for the war waged on fat people. The government allocated more money to scientists for research on the harmful effects of obesity. The number of plastic surgeries, particularly tummy tucks and liposuction, doubled in number from the start of the decade to the end of it. Gym membership skyrocketed that decade. Major diet industry companies like Jenny Craig and Weight Watchers changed their marketing schemes, which resulted in them raking in millions of dollars for the diet industry. The diet industry at the time was already well over a century old. Americans had been dieting and trying to lose weight for decades. But with this war waged on obesity, the early to mid 2000s is a pivotal moment in history for the creation of this modern diet industrial complex. The CDC's report cemented a growing belief. Fat people were dying rapidly, and the only solution was to kill them quicker, either through forcing them to transform their bodies or forcing them to die trying. Despite how theatrical that reads, or in this case, that sounds, that is what is being demanded of fat people. The goal was and continues to be to eradicate fatness. To do that, one was to either overinvest in dieting, which has proven to be ineffective, or die trying to reach an ideal weight defined by organizations like the CDC and the World Health Organization, either on an operating table or in a gym. To close, what is happening to fat people, the societal and systemic bias and marginalization they have to navigate, is in large part due to one CDC report heard around the world. And to this day, the CDC continues to be at the forefront of selling obesity as an epidemic. What you have heard from me today are clear examples of the ways that health has been constructed and the ways that government, science, and media industries have allowed that construction to set the precedent for or be the foundation of the ways that they would profit from the deaths, discrimination, and subjugation of fat people, and in particular, Black fat people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deshaun. That was an amazing, amazing keynote. And we're so excited to have you here and to have heard such a beautiful summary. We want to open it up for questions. So hi, everybody. Just to introduce myself, I'm Amanda Montgomery, she, her pronouns. I'm part of Radical Public Health at UIC. And we, would love to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes having some discussion and Q&A. So if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can go one by one and answer questions, or put questions in the chat and we can have them answered. So maybe just to get started, I can ask you a question. We have some questions that also came through when everyone signed up and filled out the initial entrance information. And actually, I think Mackenzie just asked a very similar question to my first one. So because BMI and weight are very commonly used in public health and in medicine and a lot of these fields, do you have opinions or thoughts about metrics that we can use to assess health besides the BMI?
So I am not aware, to Mackenzie's question, I'm not aware of any that are already being used. I have not come across any in my research, and I also have not experienced any in my own personal life, unfortunately. So I'm not aware of those that already exist. However, I am not interested and I think that this is going to be a more radical take in a public health space. But I'm not interested in building or creating a metric to determine people's individual health, right? Precisely because I understand health to be an anti-Black structure. And so I think that to offer a quote unquote alternative or something to replace it, to me, insinuates that there is something legitimate or valuable about our current metric, and there is not. So what I'm interested in is in finding ways for doctors, physicians, other folks in the public health field and in the medical field at large. I'm interested in finding ways for these health professionals to be able to determine ways for folks to, or rather to analyze how folks are feeling in their body, how well or not well they're feeling within their bodies, and going from there within their, examinations. I think that a lot of times, to give an anecdote of my experience, I went to the doctor a few months ago, and based solely off of nothing besides my weight and my BMI, the doctor proposed to me that I try to lose weight. Didn't ask about my exercise or didn't ask about my diet, nothing like that. And his reasoning was not because there was anything that was coming back that was alarming about my quote unquote health, even as a disabled person. His reasoning was, and I quote, "Maybe you will feel more confident." And my response to him was, I've never actually named that I did not feel confident in my body, right? But what that clarified for me is that so much about the ways that fat folks are engaged, even in medical space, is in a way wherein we are so much about how we show up is contingent upon whether or not we can be read as desirable. And desirability, even in that way, right? This is from a doctor who was not interested in building any sort of like intimate relationship with me, who still felt a need to see my fatness as something that removed me from the possibility of confidence, right? From the possibility of desire. And that was enough for him to suggest weight loss to me based solely off of my BMI. And so if that is the basis of how we're being engaged by an entire institution, my only interest, the only interest I have in health as a metric is in its destruction. And I am not interested in building, I'm not interested in building something that comes beyond that, because that is the foundation. And so if there is something that happens beyond this moment, I imagine that it's something that we all collectively decide upon together. But my focus is on destroying the very thing that creates the conditions for me to experience such a thing, from someone who spent many years in school. That was his medical advice. So yeah, that's my thoughts on that.
Thank you so much. And thanks for sharing your experience as well. I think that was super helpful to hear. I see there's a hand up. I think you were the next person. Risika, if I'm saying your name correctly, do you want to ask a question?
Yes. Yes, so I'll share. Thank you so much for sharing your experience about going to the doctor. And I just wanted to build upon that conversation and ask, just as a Black woman who's existing in a world that is just so harmful, I'm wondering how I can be an advocate for myself and for children, especially because as an adult, I've had the privilege to not grow up in the Instagram, TikTok, BS of body image, and just feeling the need to control a person's body and just assigning someone's worth and value to the way that they appear. When we are going to the doctor to just see if we're okay, how can we navigate the conversation to prolonging our lives and our health outside of the way we exist? I think it's actually ridiculous that I went to the dentist and they weighed me. Like, I came here to get a dental checkup, but they weighed me and they checked my blood pressure and they tried to tell me I had high blood pressure, but I know it was bullshit because, excuse my French, because I was rushing to the doctor's office to not be late. So how can we navigate these spaces? And then just especially as an older sister, having women in my family who are larger just naturally, not necessarily healthier than me or anything, how can we take our power back without making it an issue that we have to be policed in the doctor's office?
First of all, I'm stuck on the fact that they weighed you at a dentist's office. That is that is outrageous to me. But I'm going to do something unusual, and I'm going to ask you a question in response to your question. Did you grow up in the 2000s?
Okay. I was born in 1996.
Period. Me too. Okay, so I want to ask you, what would have been affirming for you to hear and experience from folks around you while living through that heroin chic era, right? Where everything was about low-rise jeans and really thin bodies and you know, that entire era that we lived through in the 2000s. What would have felt affirming for you? You don't have to have a full answer, by the way. Just
yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I don't think I've really ever been affirmed in my appearance.
Yeah.
Because it's always something that a Black woman isn't, especially when it comes to her hair. And then especially being dark skin. So it's just so many different issues. So once I get down to size, but I think skinniness is a construct that is created to perpetuate a lot of just toxicity. As a person that was growing up in the 2000s, I think I definitely had internalized fat phobia, and I'm thinking about the 2000s. I'm thinking about that Raisin and how her appearance changed, and how I had aunts and elders around me saying like, "Hey, she's getting a little bit too big. She's getting a little she's not taking care of herself." And then now to be 26 and just knowing how your body changes, your metabolism changes.
Yeah.
So therefore your body will look different. It's interesting. I think I'm self-aware of what it means to not let someone else's projection of how I look define me, because I choose to be conscious in that way. I think I just tune it out, but I worry for the Gen Zs because just being a younger person, you are a little bit more susceptible to someone else's opinion.
Yeah.
I can honestly say I don't care. Like, I'll post a picture of myself and feel like the best thing ever, but it took a while to get there.
Yeah.
But yeah, it sucks.
Yeah.
I think what helps me are the Lizzos and the Rihannas and the Fenty Savage, and just affirming myself with those images and staying away from anything that's anti positive. So I hope that answers the question.
No. So I was asking you that because I love that there's this focus for you on wanting to protect and care for the children, right? And I have that very same interest. And I remember asking myself like a very similar question to what you asked me when you first started to speak. And then I thought about my experience growing up in the late 90s and the early 2000s, like, and the ways that we lived through another iteration of the exact moment that Gen Z is living through right now. And so I think for me, that helped me to reflect on, or it helped me to reflect on what my experience was, to figure out how I wanted to show up for folks who are like in younger generations than I am now. I think that the most important thing to me is being honest about the world in which we live, and also offering the children in our lives different ways to view themselves and their bodies. I think that a lot of times adults really sort of undermine how much children can actually understand and how much they are actually capable of holding. And in conversations with like my younger cousins and like just younger kids that I've like spoken with, it has made clear for me that like kids understand a lot and they can hold a lot more than we like to think. And so I think being honest with them about the world in which we live and also offering like, hey, this is the world that we live in. And also you don't have to believe this about yourself. And a way to stop this perpetuation happening to other folks, you don't have to treat other people in this way either. So how can you prioritize, center, show up for, care for people who look like this, and this, right? And not prioritize and show up for and idolize people who look like this, and this. And building enough confidence in them, or helping them to build enough confidence within themselves to be able to live with that understanding while navigating, you know, this Instagram, TikTok era that we're navigating. I think that for me is the best and most approachable way. And I hope that answered your question at least a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a long-winded battle.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Risika. That was a great question. I see we have 2 hands up, but there was also a question in the chat. So I'll read that one and then we can go to Michael and Hilda. So this question is, I'm a nursing student and I'm taking in all this information about poor science. Do you have suggestions for how you think health professionals should discuss health risks associated with larger bodies in a consensual and affirming way?
I think that the answer to that is no, I do not think so. And I do not think so because there are no health risks associated with people in larger bodies. Or that's not true. There are health risks associated with people in larger bodies, and that is because of anti-fatness, right? What we just sort of worked through is this idea that so much about the way that science is constructed to determine what is and is not a health risk for fat folks is data that's 30 years old, right? It's a complete miscalculation of the ways that that our bodies are actually being harmed or not being harmed by these numbers. And so I think that the best thing to do is to, I think as health professionals, the best thing to do is to curate space for yourself to where you're able to determine like, or set apart this real information from what's fake, right? And also be able to engage with your patients, allowing your patients to tell you what their needs are and how you can meet those needs. 9 times out of 10, we can tell you those things for ourselves. And when you go into a doctor's office for a typical checkup or for a very specific reason, you're not there to hear your doctor tell you that the only solution to this thing is to see yet another dietitian or yet another nutritionist or yet another doctor and specialist, right? And so, yeah, I think that it is internalizing as a health professional that these supposed health risks associated with being in a fat body is not something that is contingent upon them losing weight, but rather it's something that's contingent upon science and scientists, medical professionals, finding other ways to determine rather whether or not someone is doing well within their body and how they can help them in that way. So I hope that is a helpful answer for the person who asked the question.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. And I know some people wrote some great examples in the chat too, some good responses. Michael, do you want to come off mute and ask a question?
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to try to explain what my question is, but you'll have to forgive me if I'm not being entirely clear. So I guess what I'm wondering is how, as health professionals, we would navigate, I guess, like a shared decision-making that prioritizes the patient's autonomy in a situation in which losing weight was something that they wanted or were trying to elect to do. And I guess the reason that, like, the situation that brought this to my mind is my younger sister in this past year had been told by her doctor that she was like pre-diabetic or whatever, and she's been engaging in improving her diet, changing her diet, exercising more and feeling better, and there's been weight loss associated with that. And I guess I'm a medical student, so I imagine myself one day sitting down with a patient, and in that situation where I was like, oh, like your A1C is high, we could be talking about starting medicine, we could be talking about engaging or changing your lifestyle or behaviors or choices or exercising more, not even with necessarily losing weight. But so I guess what I'm wondering is if the patient is particularly stuck in an idea that losing weight is like the proper response to this, but we as clinicians know that they're very unlikely to, I guess, like succeed in their goal because they might not have the resources to actually change the way that they're distributing like their stress or health behaviors such that they could change the way that they eat or the way or how often they exercise without making some sort of other compensatory change that like preserves their whole health and not just their bodily health. And I know I got kind of off track there at the end, so if you need me to clarify, please please let me know.
I think that was very clear. Thank you. I love this question. And yes, I think the thing about this is, and this is why my immediate answer is not necessarily to start by asking like the patient about what their specific goals or needs are, because I think that fat politics is a relatively new concept. And so more often than not, the fat patient in front of you is not going to have a goal around not losing weight. They're not going to have a goal around not seeing their weight as a moral failing or as, grotesque, right? And so I think that what you named, I love what you just said. You said that, if we as clinicians understand that they're unlikely to succeed in this goal. And I think that it's about starting from there. And maybe, of course, not naming that in that same way, but by offering science and statistics that help to verify for the patient that this is not something that you absolutely have to do, right? And that this is also something that requires a lot of a person that very well may not lead you to the end goal that you're seeking, and being concerned with making clear that health is about something that is much more than, like you said, that is much more than just physical. And so being that that is the case, right? I always tell people that fat folks, I don't know a single fat person who wants to lose weight. I know fat people who have been coerced into believing that they have to lose weight. And so because of that, how I approach fat folks who quote unquote want to lose weight is in a way that names or that clarifies for them that their desire for this is more often than not produced by the world around them and the ways that they've been engaged. And then trying to offer ways for them to feel like they are actually succeeding in what they really need, right? So if your sister, for example, is really in need of finding ways to deal with or handle her like being on this like pre-diabetic track, right? How can you approach that and not think about what it looks like to lose weight, right? And of course, weight loss for a lot of people comes as a response to exercising more and changing your diet. Like that happens for a lot of people, and for a lot of people it doesn't. So it's also, you know, like about being clear that being clear with your patient that not everyone who gets in the gym is going to come out with the body of Jason Momoa, right? It's just, it's not going to happen for so many people, and that our bodies are not sculptured by ourselves alone. That so much about, you know, our own family structure and things of that nature also play a role in all of that. And so thinking beyond just your physical body and whether or not you are going to lose weight, and thinking more about how you can handle the issue at hand, as well as how you can handle the sort of mental weight that comes along with being discriminated against in the world as a fat person. I hope that that helped.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was a great question too. We're gonna ask a question that was submitted at the beginning too, before we move on to the other two hands. I think we can get to them all before we're out of time. I'm wondering if you could also share your thoughts on how we can address fat phobia or promote fat liberation in school settings, or even, I know you mentioned earlier, the diet industrial complex, how we can kind of do that in those spaces.
I think that doing things like this is really important, right? I know that most of this space is made up of health professionals in varying degrees, and it looks like exactly this, having experts come in to help shape curriculum, and there should be curriculum, by the way, on these things. It looks like having experts come in to shape, you know, your residency, or to shape, you know, how you're going to go out into your internships or whatever, like whatever type of professional work that you're doing. I believe that it looks like making sure that you have experts and folks who care about these issues on a very real level, inserted into every iteration of what you're building, because as health professionals, you know, I think that sometimes, not even just as health professionals, but just as professionals in general, a lot of professionals forget the fact that once you enter into like the workforce, your job for most of us really is not only about you. It's about other people. And with health professionals in particular, it really has so little to do with you and so much to do with so many other people. And so what can you do to help create a sort of communal experience wherein you and your colleagues and your peers are building interest in and creating the correct connections and opportunities for people to be able to build their capacity and understanding of like anti-fatness as a structure, and help to implement those things within your curriculums, and therefore outside of your like school spaces and into your actual like workforce and work field. I think that for me is the most important thing. And I think it's also about recognizing that these things do not happen overnight, that it does require what my friends and I call intimate struggle, which looks like, you know, being willing to struggle with the really hard, really complicated, really uncomfortable, uneasy conversations and understandings of how things work, and knowing that at some point you're going to fuck up, and also knowing that at some point you're going to learn that you don't have as much knowledge as you believe you have, and that your position as a health professional does not actually mean that you know more than the people that you're caring for. I think oftentimes health professionals show up in a space where they believe that because they've gone through all these years of schooling, that they automatically have a particular level of authority and therefore more power and knowledge than the people that they're caring for. But you cannot know more about a person's body than they know about themselves. And so it's imperative to me that you show up in this space, understanding it to be collaborative, that just as I am showing up today as your patient, you are showing up today as someone who's here to listen to and understand what I'm experiencing in my body, and we can work together to determine what happens from here. So that's my response to that.
Thank you so much. That's so important and so powerful. I just want to note Brian put a follow-up question in the chat. If you want to share other experts that you would call attention to for folks to learn from in thinking about getting information from other sources or bringing other people in.
Yes. Well, for one, the first I'm going to throw out there are my brilliant cast of co-hosts on Unsolicited Fatties Talk Back, of which Brian is one. And that includes Caleb Luna, Jordan, and Mikey. Mikey, if you are familiar with like any of like the Hayes community work and things that have been happening recently, you've probably seen Mikey's name a lot. You should absolutely be following her and getting acquainted with all of what she does. I think that, you know, I learned from all four of those folks and am grateful to just be sharing space with them. I believe, of course, that everyone should be reading Sabrina Strings. Everyone should be reading Sabrina Strings and watching her interviews and all of that. She is, I believe, just so brilliant and brings such a special thing to this conversation. And there are so many brilliant folks. Brian named earlier in their comment from the Word Association game that we lost someone that was very important to us recently, Kat Pause. And I'm going to say that, you know, her work deserves to be researched, studied, and looked over for years to come. And so please, please engage her work and the work that she has done. And the important thing about her work is that when you engage her work, you will not just see her work, you will see the work that she's amplified for so many other people. Queering Fat Embodiment, which is the text that she helped to edit, introduced me to so many brilliant fat writers who have done amazing fat scholarship that I wouldn't have known about if not for her work. And so, yeah, there's also Amy Farrell and Natalie Barrero, and there's just so many brilliant Kiese Lehman who everyone knows I love. So many brilliant fat thinkers and scholars that should always be being engaged. And yeah, I'm just grateful for that question, Brian. So thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing all those names. And I know that we put a link to our resource guide here, and maybe we can add all of those in too so folks can access them. That's super, super helpful. Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Hilda, if you want to ask your question and then we can wrap up.
Hello, Deshawn, and once again, I want to thank you for that complex history that you provided. Light bulb. Let me tell you, light bulb went on. So thank you so much. I want to get your opinion on this. Why is it that this small, simple 3-letter word that we call fat has such a negative connotation to it? And I say this because I too am a 1996 baby. And I am the oldest sibling, the oldest cousin from both sides of my family, and I cherish my babies, my cousins, with all my heart. So when my little cousin Evelyn comes up to me and I ask her, how's school going? She tells me, oh, I was fat shamed today, or when she's when she's arguing with her little sister or other cousins, and her first comeback is, I know that I'm fat. I know that I'm fat. So stop it. Brings her body type and her image to something that isn't even a part of the conversation or part of the reason why people are arguing. It breaks my heart. It really does, because that's it. So why is it that this is such a negative thing?
Yeah, it's heartbreaking to witness people be actively discriminated against, be actively harmed and judged and berated for existing in their body. And I think it's even harder to witness that and feel like almost helpless around what you can do to help them. And so what I will say in response to your question is that it is, the answer to your question is in simple word, in the simplest term, is anti-Blackness, right? That word fat has such a negative connotation because of the ways that people associate it with Blackness, and the ways that it has been consistently associated with Blackness. And so what I always say in all of my like talks is that, you know, folks who are not Black, who are experiencing anti-fatness in this way, are experiencing the residue of the violence of anti-Black anti-fatness, which is to say that folks are experiencing a reality wherein they are being punished because they are not supposed to be in association with fat folks who are always supposed to be, who have always supposed to have been Black. And so I think that it's going to continue. It's something that will never not hurt, that will never not pain you to witness, especially for those that you love. And I think that for me, the importance of this is in connecting those issues to anti-Blackness at large, so that there's a commitment from you to show up for the folks who are at the center of, or like who are experiencing, you know, the brunt of anti-fat violence, and in doing so, making space for your cousins and your siblings to be able to hopefully experience an easier and you know, more thoughtful and caring life experience. But I wish that there was, you know, I tell myself every day, I wish that there was a magic wand you could wave around and end it all, so that none of that had to be experienced. And the unfortunate part is that there isn't. And so the magic has to come in our commitment to destroying these concepts, to destroying these ideologies, to destroying these structures, so that folks do not have to experience that. That for me is where the magic comes in. And it's not the wave of a wand, but it's a continuous wave of a wand, right? And when that wand sort of loses some of its magic, we fall on our community to be able to rebuild that magic again, so that we are one day able to experience something that's not this.
Thank you so much, Hilda, for sharing your experience and asking that question. And thank you, Deshawn, for your whole speech, and then also just answering so many questions. I think it's been so insightful and helpful to, I know, a bunch of people on here. So we are so grateful. The last question that I want to ask you, and then I'll pass it off to my co-host, Allison, because it's almost 7:30, is how people can get more of you, if there's ways to follow you on social media, if you have events coming up, things you want to shout out.
Yes. So you can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at Deshawn LH, DASHAUN LH. And you can also find my work, my portfolio, and ways to contact me through my website at DeshawnHarrison.com. And yeah, that's how you can get in contact with me.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much. If there's anything else you want to end with, feel free, but then Allison, let's go.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all of you for joining and listening and engaging and being so thoughtful. I hope that it has been good for you and to you, and that you are able to take what you got from this today and pass it on to someone else. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you, Deshawn.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just want to keep echoing thank you, thank you, thank you to Deshawn. I know that the chat is blowing up with love for them and this presentation. And I also wanted to say thank you all for attending. There's a very short post-event survey that's up on the screen. You can follow the QR code or the bit.ly link. And we would just love to hear what you thought about this event, so that hopefully we can continue to put on more like these and have more wonderful experts like Deshawn. And then we also just wanted to say a short thank you to the Collaboratory for Health Justice and the Center for Student Involvement at UIC for sponsoring this event and providing funding for it. And then lastly, I will go back to the survey because I left that QR code up for not enough time, but these are just contact information for RPH if you're interested in joining Radical Public Health or reaching out to talk about the event, any of our committees. Also, in terms of the recording for this event, it should be sent out through email to all those who registered. And if you don't receive it, once it's ready, you can always reach out to us through Gmail, or if you know any of the other moderators who presented this evening. So I'll go back to the survey QR, but otherwise, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Deshawn, and have a good rest of your night.